Welcome to an exciting online live webinar where we aim to share with you the newest information on polyunsaturated fatty acids during the critical first 1,000 days of life and the impact on child health. And we want to particularly look at the question whether current information can overcome the existing controversies. This webinar is brought to you by the Charitable Child Health Foundation, seated at the Children's Hospital of the University of Munich, jointly with the European Academy of Paediatrics and the European Foundation for the Care of Newborn Infants. So let me start with introducing the three organizations and also myself. I'm Berthold Koletzko. I'm a professor of pediatrics working at the University of Munich and the Chauner Children's Hospital. And I also serve as the chairman of the board of the Child Health Foundation. The foundation was established more than 20 years ago to promote and strengthen child health, focusing on promoting research and scientific exchange in the area, the development, evaluation, and implementation of prevention strategies, and the dissemination and implementation of established evidence. The foundation had planned to do a seminar on this topic at the World Congress on Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition, and has received donations for that purpose from Danone, DSM, and RB. And since we couldn't do the workshop because the meeting could not be held due to COVID, we decided we will try to share some of the information, at least at this webinar. The European Academy of Paediatrics was established in 1961. It's the umbrella organization of the national pediatric associations across Europe and also the European pediatric subspecialty organizations. Its mission is to promote child health in Europe. It aims to improve standards of training, service, and research, and to represent the professional interests of pediatricians. And in this regard, it has an important political role because it incorporates the section of pediatrics at the European Union of Medical Specialists, which of course establishes the standards for training in the specialty across the European Union. And finally, our third partner is the European Foundation for the Care of Newborn Infants, established in 2008 as an umbrella of many national parent organizations, first in Europe, but actually now reaching out far beyond Europe. It is aiming at improving the situation and care of mothers and newborn infants, to promote the best start in life, and to call attention to the growing challenge of preterm birth and its significant impacts. It aims at reducing health and social inequalities in relation to preterm birth. It has launched the European-wide project for European standards of care for newborn health, and it has established last year the Global Alliance for Newborn Care. So allow me to share with you the program for today. After this short introduction, we'll have a presentation on the DHA supply, docosahexaenoic acid supply in pregnancy and the risk of preterm birth. And I'm really delighted that we could win Professor Susan Carlson from the University of Kansas in the United States, who is a leader in research on omega-3 fatty acids in the perinatal period, who has contributed amazing work to this field over decades. Then I will follow with a presentation on the question whether infant formula should provide only DHA or the omega-3 fatty acid DHA along with the omega-6 fatty acid arachidonic acid. And finally, Silke, who is the chairman of the board of the European Foundation for the Care of Newborn Infants, will comment on the parents' expectation for the evaluation of foods for infants. And after that, after all the three presentations, we'll have a session to look at your questions and try to respond to your questions and comments. Quick guidance on this webinar: all your microphones are muted, so if you have questions or comments, please submit them by typing them into the question and answer box, which you find at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat box. We'd prefer if you don't use the chat box for this, but use only the question and answer box for your questions and comments. And for your information, this webinar will be recorded, and soon after today, we hope to make it available at Kindergesundheit.de, the website of the Child Health Foundation. So you can view it again if you want to and look at particular details, and you can share it with your friends and colleagues at this website. So with this, it's time to start, and I would like to hand over to Professor Susan Carlson to get us started with her presentation on the role of DHA in pregnancy. Susan, the floor is yours.
So this is Susan Carlson coming from Kansas City, and my presentation today is to talk about DHA supply in pregnancy and the risk of preterm birth. So my objectives today are to very briefly address the question, why is there an interest in DHA in pregnancy, and give some of the very early evidence that supplements with DHA can reduce early preterm birth and preterm birth overall. I'll then move on to just briefly share the conclusions of the 2018 Cochrane Review that was published in November 2018, followed by the primary results of a very large trial designed to test the hypothesis whether DHA can reduce early preterm birth, the ORAP trial, which was ongoing at the time of the review and not included in that, but published in 2019 in the New England Journal of Medicine. And then what I want to spend most of my time on, though, today is talking about the secondary results from that trial, which actually were just published this year and led to some concern among folks about whether women entering trials with high DHA status might actually not only not benefit, but perhaps actually have some harm related to further supplementation. And following that, because that led to a safety concern in our ongoing ADORE trial, which is a multi-site trial that's just concluded enrollment several months back, we felt for safety reasons we should look at whether we were getting a similar signal for a risk in our population, because everyone in our population is supplemented either with 200 or 1,000 milligrams. We did not find a signal, as I will share, and the hierarchical modeling that we did of the means from the ORAP trial, I will share that as well, followed by some summary comments next. So why an interest in DHA? DHA, as is well known, it's a nutrient. It's found in few food sources. Ocean fish are the best source of DHA, followed by shellfish. However, most Americans and probably many people in many parts of the world get most of their DHA from chicken and egg consumption. We do know that dietary intake of DHA is low. These results here showing it's around 60 milligrams per day for pregnant and lactating women and adult women in general. Are relatively old, but I can tell you that in our ADORE trial, we looked about a year ago at what the dietary intake of DHA was, and it's, again, very close to these exact numbers here. So we have evidence that dietary intake of DHA is not increasing. Supplement intake may be, and we'll talk about that in this presentation. The recommendations made, again, by an expert panel some years ago are for about 300 milligrams per day during pregnancy. That intake, I have to say, is a best guess. It's not been related to any functional outcome particularly. So keeping this in mind, in 2006, we began a trial to ask, could 600 milligrams per day of DHA compared to placebo improve pregnancy outcome? And we were looking at things like gestation duration, birth weight, and our second primary aim was to look at cognitive function over the first 6 years. The results of these have been published, the primary outcomes in the AJCN paper referenced here. There were 350 women randomized, and 301 we could actually find their delivery data. They delivered, some of them delivered in other hospitals, and we were not able to get that data. I do want to point out that in 2006, prenatal supplements with DHA were not readily available in the United States. We did not find women were consuming capsules with DHA in their prenatal until near the very end of the trial, in which case we found a few women consuming a couple hundred milligrams per day in a supplement, in addition to being in our trial. And the one thing I want to point out is that the average red blood cell phosphoglyceride DHA at that time was very low. It was 4.3% at the pre-study level. I will refer to that number again. So, as I said, the primary outcomes have been published, but the secondary outcomes, one of our surprises was that the increase in gestation duration, which we found, was almost entirely due to a reduction in early preterm birth. And as you can see from the slide, particularly the days hospitalized, the differences in days hospitalized for infants born preterm in the two groups was dramatically different, demonstrating the vulnerability of being born early compared to later preterm birth, which was what we found, that there were preterm births in the DHA group, but they tended to be after 34 weeks. So we probably should not have been surprised by this finding. The results of the Domino trial, a very large trial that had been published 3 years earlier in an Australian population and led by Dr. Maria Makrides, had a similar secondary finding. And this actually, I should say, led to their ORAP trial, which we're going to talk about, and our ADORE trial, which were designed with looking at early preterm birth as a primary outcome. And many years earlier, Olson had also studied women at high risk of preterm birth and showed a reduction in early preterm birth, but as you can see, it went from 15 down to 11%. I don't think people paid a lot of attention to this trial because there was still a very high rate of early preterm birth, even in the women who got supplementation. But the important thing to note about Domino and Kudos is that they were both done in women at low risk or not considered at risk for early preterm birth. So the Cochrane Review. The Cochrane Review asks the question, omega-3 fatty acid supplementation during pregnancy, what is the evidence for benefit? This state-of-the-art review included 70 RCTs involving nearly 20,000 women. It compared omega-3 interventions, supplements, or food, but I have to say most were supplements, compared to a placebo. Most trials were conducted in upper, middle, or high-income countries, and nearly half the trials included women at increased or high risk for preterm birth. The findings from that trial demonstrated high-quality evidence for a 42% reduction in early preterm birth using 9 RCTs with 5,204 participants, and an 11% reduction in preterm birth overall using 27 RCTs with about twice as many participants. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the ORAP trial, this very large trial, again led by Dr. Maria Makrides in Australia, was ongoing at that time and published the next year. And the primary outcome, as I said before, was to reduce early preterm birth, less than 34 weeks gestation, with a DHA EPA supplement. It was a placebo-controlled trial with DHA 800 milligrams and EPA 100 milligrams supplement from less than 20 weeks to 34 weeks gestation. So they stopped supplementation when women reached the targeted date of their primary outcome. The supplement used was the same as the group's early Domino trial, as nearly as I can determine, and what they found was a no-effect trial. The placebo and DHA groups both had around 2% early preterm birth, respectively, in contrast to their Domino trial, which had 2.3% and 1.1% in the DHA supplemented group, 2.3% in the placebo group. So within that paper, in the supplementary material, is a table that may have motivated the secondary analysis that was published this year, and that has resulted in some controversy and concern. That, as you can see, if you look at the omega-3 group, the pre-study DHA status, from going from the lowest quartile to the highest quartile in the supplemented group, doesn't really show any change there. It looks pretty flat to me, that there's the same pretty much risk across all quartiles. But in the control group, going from the lowest quartile to the highest quartile of DHA status, you can see a reduction in early preterm birth from 2.8% down to 0.8%. And what they show in this table, and that they subsequently analyzed in the paper that was published this year, was the relative risk of getting supplementation if you were in the supplemented group compared to the control group. And as you can see there, they do look somewhat different. So in the next slide, if you focus on the figure on the left, you can see that in the placebo group, the risk of early preterm birth shown on the y-axis declines as DHA status shown on the x-axis increases. And that's what I just told you in words. The figure on the right, however, shows that compared to the placebo group, the risk increased with higher DHA status in the supplemented group. And the result they showed reached significance. Next slide. So based on this publication, we undertook a comparison of early preterm birth by pre-study DHA in our ADORE trial out of safety concern. The ADORE trial is not, by the way, a placebo-controlled trial. It's comparing 200 to 1,000 milligrams per day. So every woman in our study is getting an assignment of some level of DHA during pregnancy. And what I will show you on the next several slides, but summarize here, is that when comparing early preterm birth by higher pre-study DHA status, we can't look yet at the outcome because the study is still blinded, we find no signal for risk, but a signal actually for benefit. That is lower early preterm birth rate among women who start with higher DHA status. And when comparing early preterm birth rate to date in our nearly complete clinical trials of DHA supplementation in pregnancy, this includes not only the ADORE trial, but the PANDA trial conducted by Kathleen Gustafson that is also now concluding and has completed enrollment. If we combine those two trials and look at early preterm birth compared to early preterm birth of deliveries in the identical hospital, women in our ongoing trials have a much lower incidence of early preterm birth. So I will show you these on the next couple of slides. So the first question, is higher DHA status pre-study in the ADORE trial a risk factor for early preterm birth? We evaluated early preterm birth in ADORE by pre-study red blood cell DHA, and we used a cutoff that of 6% red blood cell DHA, which, according to our calculations, and we've gone through some detailed calculations, was the point at which risk in the ORIP trial seemed to begin. We compared those who had a red blood cell greater than 6% to those who had a pre-study level less than 6%. So there were 474 women in the group that had high status by this definition, and their mean red blood cell DHA was actually 7.7%. The mean red blood cell DHA for women with low status, and there were 402 women in that category, was 4.9%. So very different mean levels. But what we found was that women with the high pre-study DHA had a 1.3% early preterm birth. Those with the low pre-study DHA had a 3% early preterm birth. Now, keeping in mind that, again, ADORE is not a placebo-controlled trial, and all of these women have received DHA. We also looked in this next slide at early preterm birth rate in our hospital in the past 3 years compared to early preterm birth rate in women enrolled in our 2 ongoing pregnancy trials of DHA supplementation who delivered in our hospital. Many women delivered in other hospitals, but I did not include those. As you can see, there is an apparently lower incidence of early preterm birth if a woman was enrolled in one of these trials, both of which provided DHA to all subjects. So the rate in the past 3 years in our hospital has been hanging around 4.4%, and it's less than 2% in all deliveries for the PANDA and ADORE trials. So finally, in this next slide, we revisited the ORIP secondary findings. I wanted to point out that the published analysis used 4 chi-squared tests, and there are 2 reasons that model is not ideal. First, it was not a pre-specified primary analysis, and there's lots of literature to suggest that these post-stratified analyses are not a good idea. There's guidance from both the US and European regulations. Second, if it was pre-specified, the p-value for significance is much less than 0.02. It should be more like 0.006. A hierarchical model that uses previous trial priors is better for at least 3 reasons. First, it adjusts for type 1 error rates better. Second, it explicitly uses prior data. And third, the model has a better fit index. So what we found when in the next slide, we looked at a hierarchical model applied to the published quartile means from the ORIP trial. And as I mentioned before, we used the priors from their previous Domino trial that was published in 2010. And we looked at the subgroups, the probability that DHA arm was had higher early preterm birth than the control. And what we find is in the 4th quartile, there is a small non-significant signal suggesting there could be some risk. We would really like to investigate alternative models using the primary data from this trial, and hopefully we can combine and collaborate with the Australian group when our trial is finished to actually look at this in both populations. So in this slide, this next slide, I just want to illustrate that pre-study DHA status of women in our population has increased quite dramatically between 2006 and 2016, with DHA now included in many prenatals that women are taking in the US. And of course, we're enrolling them approximately 14.5 weeks into their pregnancy, so they've already begun taking their prenatal supplements. That in the KUDOS trial, which started in 2006, I mentioned 4.3%. In the ADORE trial, we have 3 sites. The Kansas City site is the 6.2%. We also have 2 sites in Ohio that differ in socioeconomic group pretty dramatically. And you can also see that when we look at this, there's differences within the trial, in the sites. There's differences in Kansas City between our site, 6.2, and the PANDA women enrolled in the same hospital, in the same contemporary period. So we do know that women's status is differing and that it has probably something to do with socioeconomic group, compliance, etc., with taking prenatals, and it probably influences outcomes of studies as well. But what I really want to point out from this slide is that when we look at the trials that we're currently analyzing in our lab, when we look at overall early preterm birth rate, it tends to be lowest in the groups or subgroups starting with the highest pre-study status. So in the PANDA and the ADORE site that has similar 7% red blood cell phosphoglyceride DHA pre-study, we're getting about a 1% incidence in early preterm birth rate. And finally, I would point out that the rate of early preterm birth in the ORIP trial does not seem that out of line given what we calculate to be the status of women in that study by comparison. So we believe they are starting higher than our KUDOS trial, but maybe a little bit lower than our ADORE trial. And again, perhaps the 2% early preterm birth rate is not that unexpected. So I put this slide in to just make one final point, and that is when we did a per protocol analysis of the 2 studies that we conducted in 2006 in Kansas City, both HUDOS and HOPE, we found that even women who took one of the assigned capsules, one of the 3 assigned capsules per day, had a reduction in early preterm birth to a little bit above 2%. But as you can see, if they took all of their capsules, it fell closer to 1%. And it does raise the question of what the role, the availability of prenatals with 200 to 300 milligrams per day may have in outcomes of our contemporary studies of DHA during pregnancy. So in summary, the Cochrane review concluded that DHA EPA can reduce early preterm birth, a conclusion unchanged by the publication of the very large ORP trial. The published secondary analysis of ORP suggests DHA supplementation may increase the relative risk of early preterm birth in women with already high DHA status. However, the signal is small with hierarchical modeling. In our ongoing ADORE trial, women with higher DHA status pre-study have so far a lower rate of early preterm birth, about 1.3 versus 3%. The ORP findings appear to be site-specific for reasons that deserve some detailed evaluation, and we plan to include pre-study DHA status in our analysis of the effects of DHA supplementation on early preterm birth in our ADORE trial. Thank you very much for your attention, and I just conclude with a picture of our Kansas State flower and the monarch butterfly, which is migrating now.
Thank you very much, Susan, for a great presentation. Again, if you have questions, please type them into the question and answer box. And now we move on to the second presentation that I will provide on the question whether infant formula should provide only DHA or DHA in combination with the omega-6 fatty acid, arachidonic acid. In terms of disclosures, I admit that I'm biased towards breastfeeding. Our research has been funded mostly by the European and national funding agencies, and I declare no conflict of interest in relation to this presentation. So we've heard already about the important role of DHA. In DHA, like arachidonic acid, can be formed in our bodies by a series of desaturating and chain elongating enzyme-mediated steps from the precursors, the essential fatty acids, linoleic acid and alpha-linoleic acid. The problem is that in humans, the activity of this pathway is rather limited. And on top of that, there's a lot of variation between people because it is determined by our genotype. Some of us have a very low activity of this pathway and are very poor in synthesizing the long-chain PUFA, arachidonic acid, and DHA, which of course are important substrates for the synthesis of eicosanoids and resolvins, thereby mediating inflammation and immune response, and also building blocks for cell membranes. So let's look at these 2 key compounds, arachidonic acid and DHA. Arachidonic acid is provided with animal lipids, including human milk, but is not found in vegetable oils. It is contributing about half of the omega-6 fatty acids in the infant brain. It's high in all tissues. Before birth, it's always supplied to the fetus across the placenta, and after birth in breastfed babies with human milk. It has an important role for cell growth and is a precursor for immune mediators and regulatory molecules. DHA, on the omega-3 side, again, is not provided with vegetable oils, but with marine foods and also with human milk. It is contributing almost all of the omega-3 fatty acids in the newborn brain and most of the omega-3 in the retina of the eye. Like arachidonic acid is always supplied via the placenta and with breast milk. We've just heard about the role in pregnancy. It also is associated with visual and cognitive development in infants and children and with a lower risk of allergy and infection. it is important to recognize that these LC-PUFA are incorporated in relatively large amounts in human tissues during pregnancy, particularly last trimester, and the first 2 years, particularly after birth, here in the brain where the incorporation is relatively high. And you can see that it is not only prenatally, but it's continuing postnatally. And of importance, there's actually more arachidonic acid, omega-6 ARA, deposited in the brain than omega-3 DHA. Where is it coming from? As mentioned before birth, both arachidonic acid and DHA are actively and preferentially transferred across the placenta from the maternal to the fetal organism. So there's always a steady supply of arachidonic acid and DHA to the fetus during intrauterine growth. And after birth, if the baby is breastfed, it always gets with human milk arachidonic acid and DHA. This is a very large study looking at human milk composition in 65 studies around the world, 2,500 women. And this study finds that on average around the world, arachidonic acid provides about 0.5% of the human milk fatty acid and DHA 0.3%. So like in the brain, also in human milk, there's more arachidonic acid than DHA on average. Does it matter? Well, the World Health Organization has stipulated has stimulated a meta-analysis on studies that looked at the effect of breastfeeding and cognitive development. And in this analysis, which included only studies with standard IQ tests that adjusted for stimulation and interaction with the child, there was an average benefit of 2.5 IQ points in breastfed over formula-fed population if one adjusted for maternal IQ. And the question has been raised whether this is due to the provision of arachidonic acid and DHA with human milk, whereas it was not provided until the 1990s, at least, in most infant formula. Well, we have good evidence that, in fact, the supply of DHA and arachidonic acid with human milk is causally related to visual acuity development. This is a study compiling evidence from different evaluations. And the overall result is if infants get these preformed LC-PUFA in the first year of life, then at 1 year of age, they have about a 1-point-fold difference benefit in visual acuity development over those infants who have not received the LC-PUFA. Now, that is a clear indication that there is an effect of these LC-PUFA on nervous system development and function. If we look at the effect on cognition, the results are less clear. This is a Cochrane meta-analysis looking at randomized controlled trials, comparing infant formula without and with LC-PUFA. And if you look at the graphs, you see there's 2 studies that demonstrate a benefit for mental development and 2 other studies that do not show any benefit, rather a slight disadvantage for the mean values, although not significant. So overall, there's no difference in mental development. And for psychomotor development, there's a positive trend with LC-PUFA, but it's not reaching statistical significance. Now, of course, measuring neurodevelopment in infants is complex, and there's a lot of other factors influencing this. So it's difficult to interpret these studies. And we believe there's one important confounding factor which was not accounted for in these studies, and that is the effect of the genotype. Because we know today that genetic variation has a very large effect on the rate of synthesis of arachidonic acid in particular, and also of DHA. On the chromosome 11, human chromosome 11, this is more than 500 single nucleotide polymorphisms that affect the activity of the desaturating enzymes FATS2 and FATS1. So in Europe, the majority of the population, about 75%, has a genotype which promotes an active conversion, an active enzyme activity. So in these 75% of the European population, if you look at the blood, there is more arachidonic acid and less linoleic acid. There's indication of an active conversion. Whereas in 25% of the Europeans, the conversion is relatively inactive. So in these people, you find more linoleic acid, more substrate, and less arachidonic acid. Importantly, the distribution of the genotype is different in different parts of the world. So if you go to Asia, for example, or to Latin America, you have a predominance of people that have an inactive conversion. So there's genetic variation across populations around the globe. Now, this matters for function, as shown, for example, in this study from England, where some 6,000 children were tested for IQ at the age of 8 years. And that was related to the genotype for these fatty acid desaturating enzymes. On this graph, you see the IQ plotted for the children who received formula, which were children fed with formula in the early 1990s, when formula did not provide arachidonic acid and DHA. You see that the children with the GG genotype have a lower IQ. These are the children with a low activity of formation of arachidonic acid and DHA. So if you cannot synthesize arachidonic acid and DHA and you don't get it from the infant diet, there is a disadvantage for IQ development at school age. If you then look at the children who are breastfed who receive DHA and arachidonic acid, the genotype doesn't matter. The IQ is similar across genotypes because these children don't need to synthesize arachidonic acid and DHA. They get it preformed from human milk. And you see that the effect of breastfeeding on IQ is much more marked in the children with GG genotype, who have an additional benefit of 4.5 IQ points if breastfed over those children with other genotypes. So that's a very strong indication that, yes, there is an interaction between the availability of these long-chain PUFA and cognitive development at later ages. If we look at the effect of the genotype, we note that the genetic variation has very marked effects on the blood levels of the omega-6 fatty acids, the homogamma-linolenic acid and arachidonic acid, and very small effects on DHA and the other omega-3 fatty acids. So this leads us to believe that the effect on cognition is not just dependent on DHA, but that arachidonic acid has quite a role to play here for brain development and function. Now, what were the recommendations on LC-PUFA intake by international organizations and learned bodies? Now, here you see recommendations from the World Health Organization, the European Food Safety Authority, and some national recommendations in Europe. And they all agree that infants, particularly in the first months of life, should receive preformed arachidonic acid and DHA with more arachidonic acid than DHA, basically following the model of breastfeeding and following what also is incorporated into tissues like the brain. In contrast, the recent European legislation on infant and follow-on formula came up with a different concept, if you like, a novel concept. From this year onwards, in the European Union, all infant formula must contain a relatively high level of DHA, equivalent to at least 0.5% of the fatty acid as DHA. I remind you again, in human milk, on average, around the world, it is about 0.3 as a mean level. So this is higher than mean human milk levels. But in contrast to human milk, no addition of arachidonic acid is required. There's no regulatory requirement for providing DHA. And first products with DHA have already been marketed, only DHA without arachidonic acid. And many of us became concerned because this is really a completely novel concept of infant feeding, which we believe has not been adequately substantiated. Infant formula with about 0.3% DHA and more arachidonic acid than DHA, or at least as much arachidonic acid as DHA, have been studied in many trials around the world and used for many years. And they all what we know is that they are suitable and safe. So in contrast to that, we don't have studies in healthy babies with high levels of DHA up to 1% without arachidonic acid. Again, this is a novel concept for babies, and we don't have documented evidence on suitability and safety. And in fact, both clinical studies and experimental studies on formula with arachidonic acid to DHA ratio below 1 raise questions as to its safety and suitability. And I just want to show you two impressive studies. One is this study by Colombo and co-worker, where also Professor Carlson was very much involved, that compared the effects of 4 formulas, one without DHA and arachidonic acid, and 3 formulas with added LC-PUFA, where the 3 formulas had all the same level of arachidonic acid, about 0.6%, but different levels of DHA, 0.3, 0.6, and 1%. And if you look at that, you might have thought, well, the more the better. If you give more DHA, you will have a better outcome. But if you give more DHA at the same arachidonic acid, you also reduce the ratio of arachidonic acid to DHA. So with a 0.3% DHA, you would have a 2-to-1 ratio of arachidonic acid to DHA, which is what you find on average in human milk. 0.6 has a 1-to-1 ratio, and 1% DHA has a lower ratio, less arachidonic acid than DHA. So what were the key results? This is one outcome test asking children to sort currants, and you see that with DHA and arachidonic acid, initially there's a better outcome than in the children who had not received DHA and arachidonic acid in the first year of life. 0.3% is better than 0, 0.6% is even better. But then at 1% DHA, the effect is attenuated. There's no improvement, but rather the results get worse again at a lower arachidonic to DHA ratio. And the same is true for this test on language capability with 0.3% DHA. There's a better result than with no LC-PUFA, but then at higher DHA levels and a lower arachidonic acid to DHA ratio, the result again is attenuated. So higher DHA with reduced arachidonic acid to DHA ratio will have a less good outcome. And this is what would be possible with the new European legislation. In addition, studies in non-human primates showed that such a concept of formula with high DHA but low arachidonic acid to DHA actually reduced brain arachidonic acid in infant baboons. So you have a distortion, if you like, of the brain composition, and that seems worrisome. So therefore, the European Academy of Paediatrics and the Child Health Foundation together brought a large number of renowned experts in the field together to look at this question, and they came up with a position paper that drew very clear conclusions. And just want to show you here the key recommendations. The group concluded that infant and follow-on formula should provide both DHA and arachidonic acid. DHA content in formula should be at least 0.3% of fatty acids, similar to the model of human milk, preferably slightly higher, maybe 0.5%, which is like the mean +1 standard deviation in human milk around the world. And this was concluded in consideration that there might be higher needs of subgroups due to genetic variation or limited body stores at birth. And at levels that have been tested in formula, which is up to about 0.6%, arachidonic acid should be at least as high as DHA, which is the current advice of the Codex Alimentarius of the World Health Organization. At higher levels of DHA, it's very difficult to come up with recommendations because that has actually not been tested. So there is really need for further research. So these are the conclusions. If you have further questions, I invite you to go online to early-nutrition.org, which is the e-learning platform on early nutrition of the University of Munich. It's free of charge. It has great interactive learning modules, and one module, focus module, is focusing particularly on LC-PUFA in the first 1,000 days. So go online and look at it. I'm sure you will like it. Like more than 10,000 people already who have used these courses in 172 countries all around the world. So with this, I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention. And now hand over to Silke Mader, who will add her view on the expectations of parents regarding the safety and suitability evaluation of food products for infants. Silke, the floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Silke Mader. I'm the chairwoman and co-founder of EFCNI, the European Foundation for the Care of Newborn Infants. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this webinar and that you are interested in the parents' expectations of the evaluating food for the infants. I would like to share with you my disclosures. I have personally no conflict of interest, but my organization where I'm working for gets several grants in the area of nutrition, but also research grants, but personally I have no conflict of interest. When we talk about the first 1,000 days and the influence of a healthy nutrition, there is a quote I would like to share with you and where I guess many of you already know. The first 2 years of a child's life provide a critical window of opportunities for ensuring appropriate growth and development through optimal feeding. There is consensus that the damage to physical growth, brain development, and human capital formation that occurs during the period is extensive and largely irreversible. Therefore, intervention must focus on the window of this opportunity. And so this is why we as patients and parent representatives really think that it is key to have more focus of this time frame of the first 1,000 days, but also have more focus on the nutrition of such a tiny baby. And my focus personally is very, very important on breastfeeding because I had myself a preterm birth 23 years ago, where in my case, I was not supported at all to provide breast milk or even to be able later to breastfeed. So for me, it's important that every healthcare professional is taking this into account when we even talk about providing formula or the right formula to these babies. It's first of all important to provide breast milk to them. And so to ensure that these babies can get breast milk and that the parents or especially the mother is able to provide this to the baby, it's important that the information and the training of healthcare professionals is proper done and that the parents and even the pregnant women and the partner receives this information in a written form already before this baby is born, because the decision to provide breast milk is for this couple definitely done before the baby is born. So we need enough and good qualified lactation consultant to support these parents. We have to ensure that there is enough space, there is privacy, there's equipment available and also supported in the end so that, as you can see here at the picture, the mother is able in her bed to really provide this very, very important liquid. There is important, especially in the time of the COVID pandemic, to ensure that parents and the babies are not separated. Again, the mother provides the breast milk, and so how can she provide breast milk when she is not allowed or be able to enter this unit? And even if she is pumping, it's not the same as she could provide breast milk directly to the baby. We need to ensure that also the mother gets healthy nutrition to be able to provide this very important breast milk and to be more motivated or convinced instead of putting so much pressure on them. When we talk about the expectations when using formula and breastfeeding is not possible, or breast milk or enough breast milk is not available, and even donor milk is not available, we have to ensure that we have a safe and a healthy alternative to these babies. And especially when this is not possible in this very challenging situation. We have to ensure that we protect this baby from harm, and that this product is absolutely free of any kind of risk factors. We have to ensure that an optimal growth is given to this baby and reach all developmental milestones, because we have only this small window, as we have heard before. This product should meet all nutritional requirements of the infant until appropriate complementary feeding can be established. And this has to be ensured when we talk about which kind of formula should be provided and how is it also provided to the parents, so that parents really can make an informed choice. Each individual component has to be proven, and the ingredients and the overall composition of the formula is based on the newest evidence and maximum proven by regulatory bodies. So parents are no experts, as you are. So therefore we have to trust that this is provided to our babies, and we have to ensure this from the companies, that they are really taking care that everything is really proven in the right way, and this really healthy growth can be done in the end. So, but when we go to these challenges parents face when they go, for example, in a supermarket, you see that there is a huge amount of different formulas where parents don't know which kind of them they should choose. There are the different varieties of products. There are difference of compositions. Parents maybe ask themselves, does it really matter? Or is the price maybe something which matters for some parents most? What are the factors who influence them? Maybe the colors, maybe where it is positioned in the supermarket, which kind of advertisement I would see about it. And there is a really difficulties for us parents to understand what exactly is in it and what needs to be in it to have a healthy growth. And profit still matters. So it is really important to understand as a parent that this has influence in the end of what I choose, which product I choose as a parent. And what we learn a lot as a parent representative in this organization, that not all stakeholders really work together. So this is really a big challenge. So the parents stand in front of this supermarket and don't know what to choose. That's the challenge. So, but parents ask for improvement. So we want really that you change, but also the products change or the companies change their market strategy. We need to have roughly tested preclinical and clinical settings to really have products in the market who are proven, who are safe, who are the ones where I know my baby gets the best if I'm not able to breastfeed or have no access to donor milk. Decisions to modify the formula compositions are regulated, so it's really important to have this on an evidence base, so that the benefit of new innovations really are taken into account and are recognized from regulatory bodies. But there also have to be enough proven. So I think one study enough is definitely not enough, so we really have to have a broad testing on this. The manufacturing process are strictly controlled, and we all, I guess, have to learn our lessons from the past so that we provide the best product to our little children. Infant safety and health and developmental outcomes have to have a priority, and the drivers of the innovations and the central of decision-making processes really have to be transparent. So the conclusion, what we as parents really call on all stakeholders, healthcare professionals, decision makers, stakeholders, policy makers, is to make adequate resources available, to have such research really available and have in the end enough research. We want to have optimal nutrition care for our babies, and they should meet the individual needs. We want that mother's own milk, so breast milk, is the key priority first, and that this is maximum supported so that we have in the end more breastfeeding or better breastfeeding rates across the world, and even in the industrial world where it's much more easier to have access to formula, have the optimal support to provide breast milk for our tiny baby. We want that the hospitals implement the protocols and the guidelines, or even in countries where there are not guidelines existing, to develop them and ensure that this is implemented. We want to have adequate and accessible information for parents to ensure that we have an informed choice. Without information, we only can maybe look into colors or into promises we have from advertisement. So we need, as laypersons, be properly informed. Infant formula must meet all nutritional requirements of the infant to ensure a healthy growth and optimal development. This needs to be the key focus on it. Components have to be proven, and infant formula products on the market have been thoroughly tested in preclinical and clinical settings. Decisions to modify formula composition is absolutely risk-free and strictly governed by regulatory bodies. So our wish as parent organizations and parent representatives is that all of the stakeholders work together, because it is important to provide this healthy nutrition for our children. They are our future, so therefore we have to work together to, in the end, meet all the expectations for us as parents, but to be very honest, for the future of these tiny babies, because they are the future of our whole society. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Susan and Silke, for great presentations. That was really wonderful. We have a number of excellent questions, so I would like to ask you to provide your responses to some of the questions we've received. Susan, can we start with you? One question, or two questions actually related to each other, is what foods contain DHA? And in the studies, what sources have been used? Fish and algal sources? And maybe I can add a third question to that in relation to food. Do you think that foods are just as effective if women eat foods rich in DHA than as compared to taking supplements?
I'll answer the first question, the last question first. Absolutely, I think food would be ideal, optimal, probably. Unfortunately, in the trials, we have all used supplements because it's very difficult to control getting a certain dose from food. And as I mentioned in my talk, we do not find in the US that women are consuming very much DHA from food. The supplements have come from DHA-enriched fish oils, as in the ORB trial. And in our trial, we have used the algal sources that are made by DSM in both our Kudos and Kathleen's Hope and Panda and our Adore trials. So those have all used the same supplement, which is a DHA supplement.
Thank you, Susan. So there's a question that I think is directed to me. What is the argumentation or reason for the change of the EU regulation to take out arachidonic acid out of formula? Well, first, I should say the regulation doesn't say take out arachidonic acid, but it says there's no mandatory requirement for a minimum of arachidonic acid. So it doesn't stipulate that people should take out arachidonic acid. It just doesn't set a minimum level for arachidonic acid. It can still be put in. Why was that put in? Well, it's based on a scientific opinion from the European Food Safety Authority. It was published in 2013, and you can go and read it. If I read it, I can't really understand the rationale fully, because the chapters on DHA and arachidonic acid are pretty similar. So I would conclude from that argumentation, you could come up with a very different conclusion. But one argument there was that there is no studies that demonstrate really the essential role of arachidonic acid by itself. All the studies basically used the combination of DHA and arachidonic acid. Now, the authors of the comment that I showed to you that was published earlier this year said, we have no studies to show the DHA alone is beneficial and safe. So that's another way to look at the same data. You can say we have no studies that show arachidonic acid by itself is beneficial without DHA. That's true, but there's also no study that show DHA without arachidonic acid is beneficial and safe in infant feeding. Right, so there's another question for Silke here. What is your view on including parents in research studies? Is it important that parents have a voice in research studies and the groups that perform research?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. So from our experience, we are now involved for about 5 years in research projects in several areas, also in nutrition, and especially in, of course, preterm infant health diseases. And what we found out, but also the researchers in the meanwhile, is that our opinion or our way of looking into your research projects are really different. That means we are looking what is meaningful for the outcome of the children or for us as parents from a long-term perspective. We look really if you are asking the right questions or really looking complex on the topic from a patient's or parent points of view. And this means in the end that the outcome of this research results are much more meaningful for the ones for whom you are every day doing this research project. So we have a different point of view and can in the end be beneficial not only for you as researchers, but especially for the ones for whom you are doing the research. And we can also influence, of course, policymakers, the media, to raise awareness on more research is needed, like this is what we are doing, and where we are also working together with Berthold, Koletzko and many other key opinion leaders in this field of getting more research and taking more attention on nutrition, because it really, as we all know, has such an influence of the rest of the life, and it's not so much attention at the moment as we would like to have it as a patient representative.
Thank you for this. Susan, a couple of questions for you. One, there is very marked effects that you've shown on particularly early preterm birth, even greater than total preterm birth, relatively speaking. So why is it that early preterm birth is particularly affected? And the second question in relation to that, given there's such large effect sizes, which are obviously important for health outcomes, is there any health economic evaluation available? Can you conclude whether it is cost effective to provide DHA to pregnant women?
Yes, so we actually published in PLEFA several years ago a cost benefit analysis that we did on women from the KUDOS trial, and concluded that even subtracting the cost of supplementing all women at 600 milligrams of DHA per day during their pregnancy, there would be a cost benefit if the government would do so. We do not have, I saw one of the questions was, do we have any recommendations from our federal groups? And the answer is no. There is no recommendation for universal supplementation of pregnant women. But I think what we have seen is that women have begun to take these supplements because they've been made available in the marketplace, and they are sometimes a bit ahead of our government, which tends to move rather slowly on these things. I think I didn't answer your first question, though.
Why is the DHA supplementation affecting early preterm birth even more than total preterm birth?
Yes, so our theory is that somehow something is influenced, perhaps inflammation is reduced, but that there's an early problem, perhaps with placentation, that you actually cannot prevent overall the rate of preterm birth that much, but that you maybe extend it a little bit. But that, of course, we absolutely do not know, because you can't do mechanistic studies in human beings. We just know there's a lot of potential for DHA. We as you pointed out, resolvins are anti-inflammatory. They're pro-resolving of inflammation. And so there's many possible mechanisms that we could consider there.
Great. There's a lot of excellent questions, and I'm afraid we probably won't have time to answer all of them. So I'm just grab one here, which is looking at the question of the arachidonic to DHA ratio in Western diets, where generally there's less omega-3 consumed than omega-6 and not that much seafood, and omega-6 intakes are higher from vegetable oils than probably they were 100 years ago. So the question is, you know, which direction should we go? Should we perhaps think of lowering linoleic acid intakes to arrive at a better balance? And I think it's a great question. I think it's a really good concept, and I would love to see that we have more data. I think it's a question that we should study, that we should do more research to answer this. The next question is, if we look at the different types of formula, infant formula, follow-on formula, formula for young children, what advice can we give with respect to levels? And I would answer the same way. I'd love to see more research to address this. For the time being, the expert group that has published the comment this year has said, let's go with infant and follow-on formula in infancy with the same advice. We have not commented on the formula for young children or for the diets of young children in general, but there is advice from EFSA that says that a DHA supply should continue throughout childhood and actually into adulthood. It should be provided with a diet through all of childhood. But I guess we have some uncertainties as to the right amounts and levels, and also to which extent arachidonic acid is needed at which ages. So I don't think we have a firm answer, but I guess for the time being, it's probably best to follow the model of human milk. Silke, one more question for you here. You said it's difficult for parents to decide what to use if they don't breastfeed. They stand in front of a shelf in the supermarket with lots of different products, and it's difficult for them to make a choice. So what would you expect to happen? Where should parents get guidance from? Should it be the healthcare professionals? Should it be other sources? What kind of solution could you envisage for that challenge?
For us, I guess, for parents, it's very important to have a pediatrician or a nutritionist whom we can ask, or even a midwife. The challenge for us often as parents is that when we are not able to breastfeed for whatever reason, we often are sometimes attacked that this is not possible, you're not a good mom because you cannot breastfeed. And in my case, I had not enough milk because I lost everything after our daughter died and Luca survived. And then I was always criticized from everybody whom I asked. Only my pediatrician, who then gave me some advice. He said officially is not allowed to give me a clear recommendation of a product or a company, but I should look about this, this, and this, and then I should make a choice. And he also explained me where I can find this on this product in the end. And that helped me a lot, because then I could choose, of course, the company, what I wanted, but it was very clear for me what I should really look for. But often this is also why I said before, to be honest and saying not to criticize and to put pressure on them, convince them to breastfeeding. But there are many reasons why, for example, parents cannot breastfeed. And also in a time of COVID at the moment, we have a lot of questions coming over. Can I breastfeed? And here also WHO has given a very clear statement on the World Health Organization's website. You'll find a lot of information. Is it possible to breastfeed during COVID? Is this too dangerous? And so on. And so therefore there's a clear guidance given that breastfeeding is always first, but also my key message is the pressure will not help in the end. It's better to convince them, provide them support, and give them information how to breastfeed. And if you are not able, then to give them the clear information and transparent information which one they should choose.
Thank you. Susan, one question here for you. Did you look at the role of the FATS gene as a strong confounder in pregnancy? Is it?
We have not done that in the ADORE trial, obviously, because we're not finished, but we did have some genetic data. We looked at FADS alleles in the KUDOS trial, and we found what you basically say, that if women are homozygous for some of these SNPs, we didn't look at a lot of them, but they have lower DHA and arachidonic acid. And the thing that was concerning to me was that if they're homozygous for certain alleles, if you give DHA, it actually lowers arachidonic acid more. So I think it's something we still should do some looking into.
And there's another question, whether vegan foods can provide DHA.
The answer is no.
Okay,
vegan foods do not contain DHA. And there have been several articles written on advice to vegans who want to improve DHA, because the milk level of DHA in vegans is extremely low, and the amount they can provide to the infant is low as far as we can estimate.
Well, one could argue that algal oils perhaps are vegan foods, so algal oils with DHA probably are acceptable for vegans, aren't they?
Yes, the microalgae in algal oils is the vegetarian source.
Right. So there's a couple of questions here relating to, not specifically to PUFA, but to breastfeeding of COVID positive mothers. And the questions are, should women that are infected by SARS-CoV-2 continue to breastfeed, or should they stop breastfeeding, use an infant formula? There's clear advice from pediatric organizations, the World Health Organization, from UNICEF, and they all agree, yes, even with COVID-19 infection, women should be encouraged to breastfeed and continue breastfeeding. There's some consideration that perhaps it might be helpful, or one should consider to reduce the risk of respiratory transmission, that certain hygienic conditions should be respected, disinfect your hands and wear a face mask. The data available so far appear to show that SARS-CoV-2 is not transmitted through human milk, although there is not a lot of data at this time, so probably more studies are needed. But the advice clearly is continue to breastfeed even with a COVID infection. So I guess we're almost at the end of our time. So let me just quickly look at the many questions here. What we can pick, one is interesting here. Does pasteurization of donor human milk lower DHA and arachidonic acid content in milk? And the data that I know show there is no market effect at all. So there is some components in human milk that are affected by pasteurization depending on the method of pasteurization, but DHA and arachidonic acid are pretty much preserved. So is there anything else that we can quickly look at? Susan, during pregnancy, is it enough to have one fish meal per week, or should DHA be presented in a diet every day? Does it store at the body?
As far as, what we know about DHA is that it can be stored in the body, so you probably wouldn't need to eat it every day, but you would need to eat a fish source that had enough DHA in it that averaged over the week would come to some reasonable level. I think somewhere around 500 milligrams is probably going to be close to ideal. So that would be a couple of good sized servings of salmon each week.
So I know you're studying now the dose question. You're comparing 200 and 1,000 milligram per day, and you don't have the results yet of the final evaluation, but based on the data today, what would be your advice? What is a reasonable dose for pregnant women to try to achieve?
Well, I think Maria Makrides recommended somewhere around 500 milligrams per day as a practical amount. And I'm sticking with that until we have better data. I think 200 is not necessarily optimal for all women, especially in the US, because They tend to not eat a lot of DHA before they're pregnant. So it will be interesting to see. But as I showed in the one slide, even in our last trial, women who had very low intakes entering the pregnancy, if they took 200 milligrams per day, had already about a 50% reduction in early preterm births. So how far down we can drive that number, I don't know. I think there are going to be some early preterm births that have no relation to DHA status. But what that number is, we don't know. It may be around 1%.
Sure. So if you look at the 500 milligram per day, how would that translate into eating fish? How much fish would a woman have to eat to reach 500 milligram a day?
I think there have been calculations of maybe a 3 to 4 ounce serving twice a week of a very high DHA enriched salmon.
Okay.
Just as an example. Of course, that's not the only source of seafood, but.
Well, it sounds like a tasty diet anyway. So you showed from the Cochrane analysis the huge effect of DHA on risk reduction for preterm births, more than 40% reduction in the Cochrane analysis for early preterm births, and in your own data, even more, 3 to 4-fold reduction perhaps. So the question here relates to the impact of that in terms of infant morbidity and mortality, intensive care, days, and all the other impacts of that risk reduction. It's a huge number, 40% less early preterm births. Can you comment on that?
Yes, and we did a cost effectiveness study just using the babies in our Kudos trial born in our hospital. And we calculated that if we were to get the same effect as we did with 600 milligrams compared to a placebo, and it was applied to the approximately 4 million births in the United States, even if we supplied 600 milligrams of DHA to every pregnant woman in America, it would save about $6 billion in hospital costs. So yes, a very big effect. And
are you aware of any other intervention that has such a powerful risk reduction effect for preterm births or early preterm births?
I have not. I think that's one of the very interesting things about preterm birth, because we do not know how to prevent preterm birth. This very interestingly, this nutritional intervention seems to be the one way we can actually reduce these early preterm births. So I think it's fascinating, and some of the obstetricians and gynecologists we're working with now are as impressed as we are, because I don't think they thought a nutritional supplement could be useful.
So Silke, you're in close contact with women who are pregnant or who plan a pregnancy or who have a baby already and think about the next pregnancy. Do you think that many women are aware of this powerful effect of omega-3 fatty acids to protect their pregnancy? And is there anything one can do to increase the awareness of women? What should healthcare professionals do?
Yes, I think one of the things we're talking a lot in the United States, and I think this is common now in other countries, is to think about what we call implementation science, which is how do we get the message to people? We, in our current trial, the ADORE trial that I talked about, the FDA is making us do this under an investigational new drug status, which means they get to dictate, and they told us that we could only enroll women. The only exclusion criteria we could have is multiple births. So they're all singletons, but they have hypertension, diabetes, just as you imagine. About 16% of them have gestational diabetes, and yet we're getting a much, much lower early preterm birth rate. In fact, I just asked the statistician this morning, we have had less than 1.8% early preterm birth in this trial so far. And as I pointed out in my talk, in our very same hospital where many women are not getting DHA because they haven't heard about it, it's about 4 4.5%. So it's actually rather startling how low the numbers are, considering that the first time we enrolled singletons that were only expected to have a healthy pregnancy. And this time around, we enrolled women who were not expected necessarily to have a healthy pregnancy, but were getting better outcomes than in our KUDOS trial. And I think some of it may have to do with what I pointed out, that women are now starting with a much higher DHA status than we had in our 2006 trial. So I'm very eager to get the results. We have our last delivery in September, and we'll be able to look at these by groups. Is there a difference between the two levels? Is there a difference based on compliance? Are there differences based on race? Because we have about a quarter Latinas and a quarter African American women in our study. So it's actually got some very significant numbers in those ethnic racial groups as well.
So can I ask you, Silke, as well on this question, awareness of women? Are women really aware of this effect, and can we do more? Should we do more to make women aware?
Yes, I guess it's a very important topic to talk about. How can we bring this into the public? Because when a pregnant woman is normally not really a patient who is addressing us because they have not so far a preterm baby. So that's just a challenge. So how can we address this topic to them? So we really have to use the public communication. That means we have to collaborate with press and media. We have to collaborate with organizations like ours to talk about the prevention aspect. But we also have to raise a lot of awareness in the area of maternal health. So that means midwives, community healthcare workers, gynecologists, we have to convince to talk about it. And we have to talk about public health areas where pregnant women can find this information and whom they trust. Because in the past, you trusted your mother or you trusted your grandmother, and you did it in this way. Today, you trust the people who are talking in YouTube, you are talking the influence, you are looking for influencers who are wearing maybe fancy clothes, but these are also the ones who influence the next generation. So that means when we in the scientific community often talk about science and facts, and we have to prove everything, you have to be evidence-based. When you go in this generation, you have to maybe talk to influencers and about bloggers and talking about them, how they think about this issue, and to convince them to talk in their blogs, in their YouTube channels about this issue. And so it's a totally different issue as it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, where you then bought a book and read this during your pregnancy, and then you did it how they have recommended it. So therefore we have to think much more complex, and we have to really address this to this next young generation. And this is something where we as, well, I'm not so old, or I feel not so old, but I have to be honest in this way, how I work with my team members who are in the beginning of the 20s, they talk about hashtags and they talk about who we have to tag to get in the end this out to the community. And so therefore we really have to think clever what we do, how we do this, whom we have to take into the boat to address this to this broad community of the women who are in this age of becoming pregnant or being pregnant, because we have maybe sometimes already to inform them before they are pregnant. It's a very important issue what we have to think when we want to convince this generation in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to think beyond publications in scientific journals.
Definitely.
And think about other ways of getting the messages out. Here there's a couple of questions relating to human milk and the variability of fatty acid content in human milk. Questions how variable is the fatty acid composition with the maternal diet, and is it affected by socioeconomic status, for example, in India and in other parts of the world? Well, it's really interesting. The human milk content of arachidonic acid is relatively stable. It's always close to 0.5% wherever you go in the world. And it's surprisingly stable even with diets that are rich in arachidonic acid. If somebody eats a lot of meat and eggs and liver, or in a vegan mother who has very little arachidonic acid in the diet, the arachidonic acid is very stable in your milk. And it's absolutely fascinating, and you start to wonder, why is it? Is there a biological reason for that? In contrast, the DHA content is much more variable and depends a lot on the DHA intake in the maternal diet, which is mostly coming from fish and seafood, other marine sources. And so if you go to Inuits in Alaska and northern Canada who have a lot of DHA in their diet because they eat a lot of marine foods, they have a very high DHA level in the milk and a high ratio of DHA to arachidonic acid. And in some other parts of the world, I'm aware, for example, of data from Hungary, where there was very little fish consumption, the DHA level is very low, and therefore the arachidonic acid to DHA ratio is high. So the question for us is, what does it mean and how do we interpret it? And my conclusion would be, if arachidonic acid is so stable in human milk, before we know better, we probably should have that level of arachidonic acid also in breast milk substitutes and not deviate too far from it. What the optimal level of DHA is in human milk, we probably still have to explore further. But for the time being, probably to go from an average value is a good starting point, and then explore how we could understand this better. Now, Silke, you had emphasized a lot that one of your missions is to promote breastfeeding and the use of own mother's milk in preterm babies. And you made an interesting comment that we need to do more to train HCPs, healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, whoever is in contact with parents. So how should we make that happen? Who is training and who is motivated in investing money in training healthcare professionals in this area?
Yes, that's a very good question, because we talk often about the issues of industrial products, but we're not talking a lot about the nature. And my experience is that many people demand today that breastfeeding is the golden drop or is the most important issue. But when you go really into practice, and even in times of COVID, we see that there is often a separation between the mother and the child. And there are a lot of course, scary opinions out at the moment, but also before COVID, and hopefully also again after COVID, the pandemic, we have the challenge that parents, or especially their mother, is often really separated directly after she has delivered, and the midwife is taking care of it. So also kangaroo care, when we talk about tiny babies or sick babies, the NICUs, so the neonatal care intensive units are separate the parents, so the breastfeeding cannot really happen. So there is often a challenge to even pump the milk and provide the milk for this baby is not supported. Parents are not getting food when they are in this intensive care unit. So how should it work? I was more on the street at my time to be able to really pump, and there was even not a pump provided for me because I was not in the hospital anymore. So I had then in the end to pump at home, or I was not able to pump at all in my time frame. And so this is still the case. So when we want that breast milk is the first choice and should be the first choice, we have to ensure that parents, first of all, have not a limitation to see their baby. They need to have equipment like a chair where they can breastfeed, or kangaroo that the milk can flow. So all this kind of, I would say, change of mind to have a new culture of welcoming parents in this NICUs, but also in a normal unit, that the mother is like a drug for the baby, which is necessary to be there. And when we talk about training, I guess it is important to, like we have it in Germany, that in the majority of the hospitals, they have a lactation consultant. So that not only the midwife is supporting them, they also have in special units consultants who are helping and the mother to provide breast milk. And we have to ensure that our culture changes, that we everywhere where we are as a woman who is breastfeeding, be able to breastfeed. So not be kicked out of a coffee when you want to breastfeed there. So we have a culture of this is a natural nutrition, which is the best you can provide. So therefore we have to think changing our minds and speaking open about this, that breastfeeding is the best. That is one thing, but how should be breastfeeding the best when you have a visiting policy in your hospital of maybe 15 minutes per day? So how should it work? And so I'm very critical here because I'm often attacked why I talk about this issue like today with you, why we are doing this, and breastfeeding is the best, but in the experience we have in the meanwhile is really that often it is a challenge in the hospitals to provide the support, to provide the space, to provide nutrition, provide access, and that is a challenge, and that is stressful for women, and therefore often breastfeeding is not working as it should.
It's really important that you raise your voice and you put your finger in the wound here. Yeah. But as an optimistic note, I would add, in my experience in pediatrics over many years, I've seen a huge change and a lot of increase in awareness and support in neonatal units for breastfeeding and providing breast milk. So we have improved. We're not at the final line, at the finish line, but we still, there's a lot of positive change. Susan, there's a couple of questions here on vegetarian women. Are women who are on a vegetarian diet more prone for preterm delivery and less birth weight? And does it help if they eat more of the omega-3 precursor fatty acid, alpha-linolenic acid? Does that work?
I think it's plausible that very low DHA intakes are linked to preterm birth. This is one of the, I know there's some studies going on in India right now to see if DHA can address their very high early preterm birth rate. So yes, I think that might be an issue, but alpha-linolenic acid has not been shown to improve DHA status significantly in any study, and we spent about 20 years going round and round on that issue. And I think it's finally, I hope, put to rest, maybe not to death, but to rest. So yes, you can't rely on the 18 carbon omega-3 to get your DHA status up.
And is it known whether vegetarian women have a higher preterm birth risk, or vegan women?
Again, I'm making a link that may be not correct, but as far as I know, India has one of the highest early preterm birth rates in the world, and they have, you know, most women follow a vegetarian diet there. We have actually worked with a couple of people and looked at status of women in India, and it's incredibly low. It's way lower than we found in Kudos in the United States, and Kudos was already very low. So yes, I think it's very plausibly an issue in their high preterm birth rates. But of course, there are other factors that could play a role in preterm birth, like stress and other aspects of malnutrition. So I think the studies need to be done to see if it could be helpful there.
Right, so we are close to the end of our timeline. So let me just look at 3 questions relating to infant requirements. One, the preterm infant requirement, and then what is the requirement of a baby aged 9 months, and what is the requirement after 1 year should we provide DHA. For the preterm infant, we have come up with a recommendation in 2014 concluding that preterm infants have a higher need of DHA and arachidonic acid than the healthy term baby because they grow more rapidly, they have more limited body stores. And we came up with a wide range between 0.3 and 1% DHA, and a similar range for arachidonic acid, with a hint that it is probably wise to go more to the higher end of the range than the lower one. And we're actually currently reviewing this and trying to update that recommendation. The 9-month-old infant, well, is usually on a mixed diet with milk and with complementary feeding. The complementary feeding composition can be very variable. If the baby is breastfed, it will get with breast milk the same DHA and arachidonic acid intake more or less than it received from birth. So in our recommendation this year, we said it's probably good with follow-on formula to stick to that model until we have better data. We are not 100% sure what the exact quantitative requirement is, but if you consider that maybe only half or a third or less of the dietary intake is coming from the milk, it's probably good if there is still 0.3 to 0.5% of DHA and at least the same arachidonic acid in there. And for the child after 1 year, we don't know, to be honest, but the European Food Safety Authority has recommended that up to 2 years, infants should get 100 milligram DHA. And in reality, most of our infants and young children get much less, usually in Europe, half of this recommended intake. So let me go back, Silke, to a related question to you here. You said you want risk-free dietetic products, you want transparent information on these products, and you want involvement of all stakeholders in that. One of our listeners said scientific proven data should be there to support products for infants. But what are adequate studies and what are adequate processes to review these? So my specific question to you, Silke, is in Europe at the moment, the basis for the recommendations is a scientific panel based on experienced scientists at the European Food Safety Authority. There's no involvement of consumer organizations or parent organizations. There's very little involvement of other stakeholders, including producers. Is this the right way to do it?
Well, we fight for many, many years in the meanwhile to have parents or patients really involved, because often it's not, I guess, a bad intention that researchers don't think about the patient's point of view. It is definitely different shoes where we are fitting in. And so we have a different way of looking on the materials. We are also looking there different on the research projects. What is the patient's point of view? We also have the opportunity to ask if I, for example, be not the right person to look for someone who were in such a similar situation, or different cultures, different backgrounds from the country perspective. We also look if there is a patient who is maybe also a healthcare professional, so they have both hearts, I would say, inside. So it is really important to have the patient's point of view. We are involved in many research projects, also in newborn screening. So I think it is important to have this different point of view. And what we also have in the meanwhile, patients themselves who are now adults. So we were with previous preterm infants who are now 40 years old and suffered because of not having the right nutrition at the right time. Like my son, he's 23 years old, he's also in this group now, and they speak up because it matters for them most. We are, I always say, just the parents, but these are the ones who suffer lifelong when they not had the right nutrition at the right time, or it was not provided in the safest way, or they had in the end not a treatment where they also could have. And so therefore it's important that we also in the future listen to the ones who were directly affected, and they have also a different point of view as we as a parent. So yes, it is very important to have in each of these decision-making bodies, parents, patients involved who have a different point of view, because then you also get different results.
Very clear message. We have a load of further questions and we could go on for another hour, but I'm afraid our time is up. So I would like to give you an opportunity to say a final sentence with a key message. So can we start with you, Susan? What is your conclusive message?
My conclusive message is I firmly believe that we need to improve the DHA status of pregnant women around the world. And preterm birth is a very serious problem for society, for families, for, as Silke points out, for the children who are born preterm. Anything we can do to increase gestation duration up to a term level, I think, is very important.
Great. Silke?
Yes, I just can agree what Susan said. It is so important to put nutrition on a different level and not only think on brain and lung when we talk about development of a newborn baby. So nutrition really influences the health of the rest of the life. So we have to take here more focus also on the importance of breastfeeding, of course, even if this topic today is more on formula, but taking into account that this is only possible if we get support, and to think that patients and parents can be a valuable partner to, in the end, bring this topic on a totally different agenda. So it is important to combine forces, work together in all levels of stakeholders and different levels in a country decision-making process. So it's important to work hand in hand and to improve this health aspects for our children. They are, yeah, our future.
Okay, so my key message is breast is best. We should do our best to support, promote, and protect breastfeeding. And if infants need a breast milk substitute to supplement breastfeeding or replace breastfeeding, we should be modest enough to follow the model of breast milk until we have hard data to deviate from breastfeeding. If we produce an infant formula, we should start from the model of breast milk and only deviate from that if we really have very good evidence for a benefit and low risk. So with this, I would like to thank you very much, Susan and Silke, for contributing with your excellent presentations and the vivid discussion. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined this webinar for your interest and your attention. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.